morning, and most of the news headlines this morning is also talking about strike and the second tier, or the three-tier pension scheme, and the second tier that it's currently going into. Now, the new pensions law, the National Pensions Act 2008, Act 766, was promulgated on the 12th of December 2008. The new three-tier pension scheme is expected to enhance pension benefits and increase the retirement income security of workers, both in the formal and informal sectors. So to educate us a little bit more on this morning, in the studio with me have a legal practitioner by the name of Mr. Akoto Ampao. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
How are you feeling?
I'm good.
Great. Obviously, you've read the papers. You can know that there's a lot of controversy, a lot of misunderstanding about the current pension scheme which is being run within our nation. The first question I want to put across to you is, what would be required of employers and employees within this new Pension Act?
Well, I think that it's important to recognize that this new Pension Act came about because of the dissatisfaction with the monopoly of Smith over pensions in Ghana and its poor payment systems as compared to the Cap 30 and also the teachers' ordinance,
right,
and also the arrangements for the military. So the idea was to have a pension scheme that ensures better remuneration for workers on their retirement.
Okay.
And the pension scheme established had three tiers. There was one, the mandatory national pension; two, the mandatory occupational pension scheme; and then there was a third, the voluntary provident fund scheme.
Yes.
Now, the obligations of the employer and the employees are as follows. The employer is supposed to pay 13.5% of the employee's contribution, as against the former SNAPE system of just 13%,
right,
into the fund. The employee is expected to pay 5%, 5.5%, as against 5% under the whole SNAPE scheme. So in all, it comes to 18.5%.
Okay.
Now, of this 18.5%, 13% is paid to SNIT, and then 5.5% goes to the occupational mandatory pension scheme.
Right.
You will notice that in the nature of the scheme, it involves the participation of workers.
Yes.
So whilst the first tier is still the mandatory national pension scheme monopolized by scheme, the second tier involves direct participation of both the employer
and the employee. Right.
It's not simply an employer-owned and organized process.
Right.
To the extent that the law makes provision that at least 1/3 of the trustees of that trust must be appointed by the members, the employees.
Right.
It also makes it very clear that once the money is paid into the trust fund, that money immediately vests in the person.
Right.
And also, when the fund is invested, any profits or benefits accruing, once they are paid back, immediately vest in the employer.
Okay.
So you can see that this is a scheme which is established. I'm talking about the second tier.
The second tier, yes.
Which is established to ensure worker participation with the employee.
With the employer, right.
And the employer should not exercise any veto powers.
Okay. Now, So in light of this, obviously, I mean, what you've explained seems to be somewhat straightforward. Now, apparently, government is going to court to seek the legal interpretation of the law setting up of the second tier. Do you think that will be necessary, or do you think it is another waste of time?
Well, I would have wished that government and the workers involved, together with their legal advisors, would have sat down to iron out this matter.
More dialogue.
Yes, and come to a consensus. I'm saying so because it is always better to reach an agreement. Where an agreement is not possible, of course, then we have to go to the courts to resolve disputes.
Right.
Now, I have to say that it is also important to recognize that the second tier scheme allows the members to move from individual, to move from one trustee to one scheme to another.
That's right.
So, in fact, this battle is, in a certain sense, all to do about nothing.
Right.
Because the government must recognize that even if there's a ruling in its favor that it has the power to set up the scheme as an employer for all government employees, the law permits the next day that the members, the employees, can all move wholesale
from one trust to another.
To another.
Right.
So there's no purpose for us to have a huge national crisis or battle over this matter.
Would you say then that, or would you say that this particular strike is justified in any way then?
Well, I think that, let me put it this way, I think that the workers have a point.
Right.
And I think that government ought to sit down with them to resolve the matter.
Okay.
Because, as I said, even if the court rules that the government is the one that must set up the trust, the law, the Pensions Act, permits the employees to move out to another trust. Secondly, it is important to recognize that the Pensions Act was supposed to come into effect on January 2010.
Right.
Now, for a transitional period, the monies, the second tier monies, were to be paid to SSNIT, and SSNIT was to pay that money into a temporary pensions fund account with Bank of Ghana.
Right.
But that account was only to remain temporary until the setting up of the
trust of who is going to hold for the second tier.
And the custodians and so on. Now, it is quite clearly obvious that it shouldn't have taken 4 years. This thing should have been resolved long ago. Secondly, it is important also to emphasize that it is not conceived under the law that, okay, let me put it this way, because government was delaying in taking any initiative, the workers, as part of the participatory process, took the initiative and negotiated with their managers or councils, boards,
yes,
and agreed on setting up this head trust fund. And then the head trust fund that they set up the occupational trust scheme.
Yep.
And that both the head trust fund and the scheme were registered and approved by the National Regulatory Authority, Pensions Regulatory Authority.
Right.
So it was thereafter then that the Minister for Finance stepped in and directed that Pensions Alliance Trust Limited is the trustee.
Right.
And there are various questions even about Pensions Alliance Trust Limited. One, did the government go through a procedure of open bidding.
Vetting, due diligence.
Open bidding, so that other trusts
Could also
legally established and registered by the National Pensions Regulatory Authority would also bid and compete. So the best
would get the job. Yeah.
Because this thing came out of the blue.
Okay, so I mean, in your professional capacity, then, how do you think we should resolve this particular issue? Because we've got workers on strike, we've got potentially government going to court to get legal interpretation. But from what you're telling us, we could have had this resolved beforehand, or a little bit of dialogue could have actually resolved this. What is the issue?
I still do think that it is still possible for the parties involved to sit down and resolve the matter by way of consensus. When you go to court, the thing about going to court is that when two parties go to court, they take away the decision making from themselves and hand it
to
over
the judiciary. Yeah.
So the court can take a decision that may not be satisfactory to either party. Whilst if the two parties sat down and ironed out their differences and came to a conclusion, that conclusion would be satisfactory to both parties. So in my view, it is always better where there is a chance for the parties to sit down and come to a settlement. And that is why in modern times there's been so much emphasis on alternative dispute resolution process.
All right. Now, just my final question before you do part. I mean, just for the average person that's out there, I mean, we know that people are on strike, but for the average person that's out there who is involved in this 3-tier pension scheme, if they are not having the second tier invested to a trustee that they want it to be done, what's their legal backing? How do they take their employer to court, or how do they resolve that issue with their employer?
They could take the employer to court for a ruling, or as I said, under the portability principle, they could just simply decide that they are moving out of the trust.
Right. So they can just go and apply for it, remove their second tier, and
move it into another trust.
Okay. All right. Well, hopefully all of these things will be ironed out very quickly, and hopefully mediation can be done so that everyone will have their bit of the cake that they need to eat. I want to thank you this morning for joining us and educating us more on the pension scheme. This has been Mr. Akoto Ampaw. He's a legal practitioner, and this has been The Chamber here on TV3 and New Day. We'll be back in just a few moments.